A Mystrikal Rebuttal to the Christian Case for God, Part 1 of 14. Necessary Being versus a Contingent Universe, Unproven Assumptions. Apologists often assert that the universe is contingent, needing an external cause, while God is a necessary being that explains existence. This argument sounds profound, but it rests on assumptions not supported by evidence. Calling God necessary is not an observed fact. It's a definition theists simply assign to their deity. There is no empirical or logical proof that any being must exist. In science, we follow evidence. The universe exists, but whether it requires an outside cause is unknown. The claim that everything contingent needs a cause, so a necessary God must exist, begs the question. It presumes only God can be uncaused. Why not consider that the universe, or multiverse, might exist without an external cause? Declaring God exempt from contingency is special pleading without proof. No scientific data indicate that an infinite cosmic reality is impossible. On the contrary, physicists have conceived models in which the cosmos could exist eternally or through quantum emergence without invoking magic. As cosmologist Sean Carroll notes, it's extremely easy to imagine eternal cosmologies based on quantum mechanics that don't require a creation event. In short, labeling God necessary does not make it real. It's a metaphysical assertion that lacks reliable, objective evidence. By the standards of science, a hypothesis must be testable and falsifiable. Necessary being fails this test, as it's defined in a way that can't be observed or disproven. It's an answer that explains nothing. One could just as well claim the universe itself exists necessarily and stop there. In practice, introducing a necessary God only shifts the mystery back a step, what caused the universe, to what caused God, and provides no clarity in answering the question. Far from providing a solid explanation, this claim relies on abstract terminology and assumed principles of classical philosophy that lack scientific validity. Without reproducible evidence that a necessary deity exists, the argument collapses under the very evidentiary standards it demands from natural explanations. A Mystrikal Rebuttal to the Christian Case for God, Part 2 of 14. Dressing up a God of the gaps as genuine explanation. The theist insists their argument isn't a God of the gaps, i.e. not merely plugging God into unknowns, yet that is precisely what's happening. Historically, invoking God to fill knowledge gaps has a consistent track record of failure. Thunder was once attributed to Zeus's anger, until the concept of electricity was understood. Diseases were blamed on demons until the germ theory explained them. The pattern is clear: whenever God did it is used to stop inquiry. The gap eventually closes with natural explanation, rendering the divine placeholder unnecessary. The current apologetic strategy is a more sophisticated gap filler. It points to things science hasn't completely explained, the origin of the universe, consciousness, etc., and asserts God as the answer, while insisting this isn't just gap filling. But if an explanation relies on science can't, yet, explain X, therefore God, it is the very definition of a God of the gaps. It offers no positive evidence for God, only an argument from ignorance. We don't know otherwise, so God must be the cause. This is intellectually hollow. A valid explanation should make testable predictions or elucidate mechanisms. Saying God did it explains nothing about how or why. It's a dead end. Even some theists warn against this fallacy because it sets up faith to shrink with each scientific advance. The apologist may protest that they have reasons beyond pure ignorance. Still, their reasons, for example, the universe needs a necessary cause, are themselves based on a lack of imagination or knowledge, for example, assuming nothing natural could possibly fill the role. Until they provide empirical, reproducible evidence of God's causal role, their argument is a dressed-up God of the gaps. Indeed, the history of science teaches us that invoking miracles or magic halts inquiry, whereas assuming natural causes has led to centuries of discovery. Pierre-Simon Laplace's work on celestial mechanics, for example, famously eliminated Newton's need for divine intervention to stabilize planetary orbits. Every time a gap has closed, natural law was found at work, not divine tinkering. The current gaps are no different. In sum, claiming this isn't God of the gaps while providing no objective, independent evidence for God's hand is simply trying to dodge a well-founded criticism. It remains an argument from ignorance, not from knowledge, precisely the kind of reasoning science cautions us against. A Mystrikal Rebuttal to the Christian Case for God, Part 3 of 14. Quantum fields, multiverse, and randomness, are they not sufficient? The apologist dismisses quantum physics, multiverse theories, and randomness as inadequate explanations for existence, implying only God can do the job. This dismissal is premature and misleading. While quantum cosmology and multiverse models are indeed speculative in parts, they are grounded in established physics and mathematics, unlike the God hypothesis, which lacks empirical support. Quantum field fluctuations are observed phenomena. In lab experiments, particles pop in and out of the vacuum due to quantum uncertainty. It's not outrageous to extend this principle to the origin of the universe. Physicist Alexander Vilenkin has proposed a mechanism of quantum creation of universes from nothing, a quantum vacuum, noting, no cause is needed for the quantum creation of the universe. He admits it's speculative and hard to test at present, but it's a concrete hypothesis in a domain where direct experimentation is tough. This is the proper scientific attitude. Explore natural possibilities, even if unproven, rather than inserting an unevidenced deity. The apologist retorts that quantum fields or a multiverse would themselves require a cause, but this simply reasserts their assumption that everything must have an ultimate cause, such as God. In physics, it's not clear that every entity needs an external cause. Quantum events occur without deterministic causes, only probabilities. Radioactive atoms decay at random intervals. No further reason why one decays now and not later. It's built into the fabric of reality. Modern cosmology similarly considers that our Big Bang may be just one bubble in an eternal multiverse or a cycle in an endless cosmic timeline. These ideas may or may not pan out, but they illustrate that naturalistic explanations are on the table and are being developed with mathematical rigor. Crucially, if one demands evidence that a multiverse or quantum tunneling could spawn universes, the same, indeed higher, standard must apply to God. Yet we have zero evidence or logical model for a timeless, immaterial mind creating physical reality. By scientific standards of falsifiability and empiricism, speculative physics is far ahead of the God hypothesis. Furthermore, the apologists' claim that randomness can't produce order is naive. Random mutations filtered by natural selection produce the intricate order of living beings. Random cosmic initial conditions, constrained by physical laws, can yield structured galaxies and complexity. Randomness within a law-governed framework is a powerful creative force, no overseer required. And suppose the issue is the fine-tuning of constants. In that case, scientists have proposed the multiverse as one explanation. If countless universes exist with varied parameters, it's no surprise one looks fine-tuned for life. This is admittedly not proven, but it's a logically coherent, natural explanation, and one that doesn't violate Occam's razor by introducing an even more complex entity, an omnipotent God, to explain complexity. The irony is thick. The apologist rejects multiverse theory as not enough due to lack of direct evidence, while asking us to accept a miraculous being with no evidence at all. In reality, quantum fields and potential multiverse remain open scientific questions, being investigated with an eye on what evidence might confirm or refute them. God, by contrast, is defined in such a way that no experiment could ever falsify his sufficiency. Thus, by the very standards of relevance and testability the apologist demands, scientific ideas, however incomplete, are immeasurably superior to invoking God. Moreover, the common reference to the Bordguth-Vilenkin (BGV) theorem as proof that the universe must have a beginning, hence a creator, is widely misrepresented by apologists. The BGV theorem shows that an inflationary universe, one that expands on average, cannot be eternal in the past. It reaches a boundary where classical physics breaks down. However, it makes no statement about the absolute beginning of all reality. Vilenkin himself explains that while the universe probably did have a beginning, the theorem does not tell us anything about the existence of God. It simply implies our expanding cosmos had some kind of inception, which could be a natural quantum regime rather than a literal creation ex nihilo in a theistic sense. Notably, no known physics forbids a pre-Big Bang state or an eternal quantum foam beyond our space-time. As Carroll observes, results like BGV don't apply to quantum cosmology, and it's easy to devise models that evade a hard beginning. In short, pointing to unresolved scientific questions and asserting that God explains them is a textbook example of the God of the Gaps argument. It carries no more weight now than it did when thunder was attributed to Zeus. Serious inquiry continues to explore natural mechanisms, as history has shown that this is the fruitful path. Until or unless theists provide reproducible evidence that God is real and intervenes, Their complaints about multiverse or quantum ideas not being sufficient boomerang back on their theory, which isn't sufficient by any scientific measure. A Mystrikal Rebuttal to the Christian Case for God, Part 4 of 14. Logic, morality, and consciousness. Do they prove the immaterial? The apologist contends that material processes cannot explain logic, moral truths, and consciousness and must be immaterial. This is a sweeping claim that does not withstand scrutiny. Let's break it down. Laws of logic. It's said that logic is abstract and immaterial, so a purely material universe couldn't account for it, often implying logic exists in the mind of God. This is a category error. The laws of logic, like non-contradiction, are descriptions of reality or of how we consistently reason about reality. They are not objects floating in some ethereal realm. They are conceptual principles. We observe that contradictory states of affairs don't occur. You can't have A and not A true in the same sense at the same time. And we codify that as a logical law. There is nothing supernatural needed for that. It's simply the recognition of consistency in nature and language. Even if one argues that logical truths are abstract entities, as in Platonism, it doesn't automatically follow that they reside in a God's mind. Saying logic is grounded in God raises a dilemma. Could God have been illogical? If even God cannot make contradictions true, then logic doesn't depend on God's will at all. It's more fundamental. And if one says God could violate logic but chooses not to, then logic becomes arbitrary, which undermines its necessary character. Either way, invoking God here explains nothing. It merely asserts without proof that immaterial mind did it. The simpler view is that logic is an emergent feature of any consistent reality and of the way intelligent beings, like us, structure understanding. A computer can follow logical operations without a soul. Humans formalized logic without needing to pray for it. There is zero evidence that logical truths come from anything other than the inherent structure of reality, physical or mathematical. They are immaterial only in the trivial sense that they aren't made of atoms. But that doesn't imply a supernatural realm. Mathematics and logic can be thought of as conceptual frameworks that we derive to model patterns. Their efficacy doesn't require a cosmic lawgiver, only a cosmos that behaves consistently. Morality. The apologist asserts that objective moral values cannot arise from material processes, implying the existence of a divine moral lawgiver. However, research in evolutionary biology and anthropology strongly suggests that moral sentiments are an outgrowth of social and evolutionary needs, rather than being handed down from a mountaintop. Empathy, cooperation, fairness. These are observed in other social animals, apes, dolphins, elephants, in rudimentary forms, indicating an evolutionary continuum for proto-morality. Our moral instincts likely developed because they helped our ancestors thrive in groups. For example, primates demonstrate behaviors akin to fairness and empathy, like consoling distressed peers or protesting unequal rewards, showing biological roots for ethics. Human morality became more complex with our greater intelligence and culture, but it's not an alien implant. It's an adaptive trait, refined by cultural evolution as well. This does not mean morality is a mere illusion or that anything goes. It means our sense of right and wrong is grounded in human nature and experience, which is consistent across cultures in many core ways. Nearly every society values honesty, prohibits murder, cherishes some form of familial care, because such norms promote flourishing. The theist might ask, but are moral truths objective then? Even if we say there are objective moral facts, a debated point, one cannot simply claim only God explains that. That's another unwarranted leap. If objective moral values exist, they may be grounded in facts about conscious beings, for example, what actions promote well-being or harm. Some philosophers argue for secular foundations of morality, that certain things are right or wrong given the nature of conscious creatures and the logical consistency of ethical systems. Moreover, invoking God raises the classic Euthyphro dilemma. Is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it is good? If the former, morality is arbitrary, God could will murder to be good tomorrow. If the latter, then goodness is a standard independent of God. Either horn undermines the claim that God is the source of morality in a coherent way. The tangible evidence favors a naturalistic origin. Neuroscience shows our brains light up in decision-making and empathy areas when wrestling with moral questions. Psychology links moral judgment to emotions and reasoning that have clear developmental and evolutionary explanations. In short, morality appears to be an evolved and reasoned phenomenon, rather than an immaterial edict engraved in the cosmos. We do not find any phenomenon in moral psychology that requires positing a deity. Humans negotiate and reason about ethics among themselves, and that is enough to explain why our moral ideas broaden over time, for example, expanding rights and empathy. The scientific standard of evidence, observable, consistent data, supports the evolution of moral behavior, whereas no experiment points to divine tablets in our brains. Consciousness, subjective experience, is indeed a challenging problem in science. But to claim it must be immaterial is an unwarranted argument from ignorance. We have substantial evidence that consciousness is deeply connected to physical brain processes. Alter the brain and you alter the mind. Drugs, brain injuries, or illnesses can profoundly change personality, memory, and conscious awareness. For example, degenerative diseases like Alzheimer's gradually strip away one's memories and sense of self as neural tissue deteriorates. If a soul were the true source of consciousness and personality, why would physical brain damage erase or change it? The correlation between brain states and mental states is one of the most robust findings in neuroscience. As the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy notes, conscious experience in humans depends on brain activity. This is essentially undisputed by experts. Now, dependence on the brain doesn't in itself solve the mystery of how subjective first-person experience arises. Still, it does strongly indicate that the mind is an emergent property of matter, the living brain, rather than an immaterial ghost. Every new insight in neuroscience, from mapping which brain regions produce vision, to discovering neural signatures of decisions before we're even aware of them, pushes the need for a separate non-physical mind stuff further away. The theist might interject that neuroscience hasn't explained why we have qualia, raw sensations, or how matter produces mind. True, but not explained yet is not a license to shout, therefore, immaterial soul. Remember, mysteries aren't magic. They are just unsolved problems. Consciousness is indeed a complex phenomenon, but there are promising approaches, for example, integrated information theory and global workspace theory, that attempt to unravel it without invoking the supernatural. These hypotheses at least attempt to be falsifiable, for example, via neural correlates of consciousness experiments, whereas an immaterial soul explains nothing and predicts nothing. It's a classic unfalsifiable plug. If you say the soul does it, how would we ever test or observe that? It's not an explanation so much as a surrender. By contrast, the trajectory of science has been that consciousness diminishes or disappears when brain processes stop. For instance, anesthesia can reversibly switch off conscious awareness by purely physical means, which makes little sense if a non-physical soul were wholly responsible for our mind. Far from being immaterial phenomena that defy material explanation, the evidence suggests that the appearance of immateriality is an illusion born of complexity. The brain is a complex information processing organ, and its exact workings aren't fully understood. But nothing about it so far requires breaking the laws of physics or positing a second substance. In summary, logic, morality, and consciousness are profound and fascinating aspects of reality, but there is no justification for attributing the supernatural as their source. Each exists and operates without observable violation of physical principles. Laws of logic are embedded in the fabric of consistent reality and rational thought. Moral values and behaviors can be traced through evolutionary and rational lines. Consciousness is entwined with biology. The theist's move is effectively, I can't immediately imagine how matter does X, so X must come from beyond matter. That's an appeal to personal incredulity, not a valid inference. And once again, it runs afoul of scientific standards. A claim that something must be immaterial should be backed by positive evidence of an immaterial realm or entity at work. Instead, we have only the gaps in current knowledge. As neuroscience and psychology advance, these gaps are steadily shrinking, just as gaps in our understanding of life, disease, and the cosmos have shrunk, all without finding any fingerprints of gods or spirits. We should not insert ghosts into the machine just because some cogs are still in shadow. A Mystrikal Rebuttal to the Christian Case for God, Part 5 of 14. DNA as Information, Debunking the Codewriter Myth. Creationist apologetics loves to claim that DNA is an information code, and since all information comes from a mind, DNA's information must come from the mind, God. This argument sounds intuitively appealing, but crumbles under scrutiny for several reasons. First, it hinges on a misleading analogy. DNA can be likened to a code or language. We talk of the genetic alphabet of A, C, G, and T, adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. But in reality, DNA is a chemical polymer subject to biochemical interactions and natural selection. The so-called information in DNA is simply the sequence of nucleotides, which has effects, building proteins, in context. There is no evidence to suggest that an intelligent agent intentionally chose this sequence. Instead, there is overwhelming evidence that it evolved through mutation and natural selection over billions of years. We have directly observed examples of new information arising in DNA through natural processes. For instance, mutations in bacteria have been documented to yield new functional traits, like the evolution of novel enzymes that confer drug resistance or let bacteria digest new food sources. In one long-term experiment, E. coli evolved the ability to metabolize citrate, a new function not present in the ancestral strain, effectively new genetic information arising without any programmer. How did this happen? Through random mutations, including gene duplications, and natural selection, beneficial changes are amplified. Biologically, information is routinely generated by unguided processes. As a BioLogos review, coming from scientists who are themselves theists, acknowledges, the majority of biologists agree that well-understood processes give rise to new information all the time. Those well-understood mechanisms include mutation, recombination, and duplication of genes, among others, which can all increase genetic information in a technical sense. For example, a gene duplication provides extra DNA that can mutate and take on new functions, an increase in Shannon information content and functional information. The creationist assertion that all information comes from minds is simply false as a universal rule. It's an oversimplification drawn from human experience with things like written texts or computer code. Still, it doesn't apply to genetics or other natural patterns. Snowflakes have intricate information, the specific arrangement of ice crystals. Do we conclude that a mind designed each snowflake? Of course not. Natural processes generate that structure. Likewise, the genetic code is an evolved molecular system, not a top-down designed code. Importantly, referring to DNA as a code is a metaphorical term. Yes, DNA carries instructions for building organisms, but those instructions were not composed by conscious intent. They were assembled through the trial and error of evolution. Evolution can be seen as an algorithmic process, an iterative search that produces complex solutions, adaptations, without foresight. We've even seen digital simulations, genetic algorithms, where random variation and selection produce information and solutions to problems without any mind directly writing the code. Nature did the same, writ large. To assert otherwise is to ignore mountains of empirical evidence from genomics, paleontology, and comparative biology. The pattern of DNA across species, with shared endogenous retroviruses and broken genes in precisely the places evolution would predict, screams of a branching tree of descent, not an intelligently designed set of separate codes. If a divine mind truly engineered DNA, we wouldn't see the sloppy redundancies, junk sections, and jury-rigged features that pervade genomes, such as the human vitamin C gene, which is non-functional, a broken copy of what many mammals have, consistent with our evolutionary history, rather than special creation. All these are entirely expected under unguided evolution, but make little sense if an infallible programmer were to do the work. Furthermore, if one insists on the term information, we must recognize that information can arise from stochastic processes. In information theory, adding a random mutation to a genome increases the Shannon information content because it makes the sequence less predictable. Natural selection then channels that information into practical arrangements. There is no mystical law that information only comes from the mind. That's an outdated creationist talking point that has been refuted in the literature of biology and information theory. In fact, to the extent that information is defined rigorously, it has been shown how mutation plus selection does create new information. For example, gene duplication followed by divergence can produce new genes with new functions, new instructions that weren't present before. The apologist might still say, but the very existence of a genetic code and the complex molecular machinery of the cell requires a designer. This is merely shifting the goalposts to the classic argument from irreducible complexity, which has been addressed. Complex biochemical systems can evolve from simpler precursors, partial evolutionary paths for systems like the bacterial flagellum and blood clotting cascade are documented in the scientific literature. There is no magic barrier beyond which natural processes suddenly stop generating complexity and only intelligence can suffice. That's a God of the gaps claim refuted by each new discovery, like figuring out how the eye could evolve in stages, which creationists once claimed was impossible. In sum, the claim DNA is information, and all information comes from mind collapses on both ends. DNA's information doesn't require a mind to originate, and minds are not the sole known source of information. What the creationist has done is anthropomorphize nature. Because human-made codes, like English text or computer software, come from minds, they assume any code-like pattern in nature must likewise. But nature is not constrained to human analogies. We must follow the evidence, and in the case of life's complexity, the evidence, fossil, genetic, biochemical, points strongly toward gradual evolution by natural processes. This explanation is relevant, empirically supported, and falsifiable. One could imagine fossil or genetic evidence that would contradict common descent, but none has been found, whereas the God-coded DNA idea is none of these things. It's not testable. Any conceivable data could be said to be what God wanted. It's not supported by independent evidence. We never see a flash of divine coding activity in genomes. Instead, we catch evolution in the act in microbes and viruses. And it doesn't even provide valuable insight. Telling a biologist God did it predicts nothing about which genes do what or how to cure genetic diseases, whereas evolutionary theory does, for example, using similarity to model organisms. Invoking an unknown designer is an unnecessary and unscientific extra step that violates Occam's razor. It assumes what it needs to prove, a designing mind, and ignores the demonstrable power of mutation and selection. Realizing this, even many theistic evolutionists accept that DNA's information content arose through evolution. They just posit God behind the scenes. But once you grant that the natural mechanism suffices, adding God becomes superfluous. By all observable metrics, mindless processes are fully capable of generating information and complexity, given time and the filter of selection. Thus, the analogy fails, and with it the argument. A Mystrikal Rebuttal to the Christian Case for God, Part 6 of 14. Hilbert's Hotel and the Infinite Regress, Conceptual Paradoxes versus Physical Reality. William Lane Craig and others often trot out Hilbert's Hotel, a thought experiment about an imaginary hotel with an infinite number of rooms, to claim that actual infinities are impossible in reality. Therefore time must have a beginning, and thus a first cause, God. Hilbert's Hotel produces some counterintuitive results, such as being able to accommodate new guests even when full, by shifting everyone over. The apologist shouts absurd, and concludes that an actual infinite number of past events or causes cannot exist. However, mathematical paradoxes are not physical proofs. There is a massive gulf between what is counterintuitive and what is impossible. In standard set theory and mathematics, which Hilbert's Hotel is based on, there is no contradiction in an infinite set of objects. Mathematicians work with actual infinities all the time, the set of natural numbers, for example, and find it perfectly consistent, just different from finites. As one mathematician commented on this very argument, to those who work with infinite sets daily, everything in a Hilbert's Hotel account seems normal and nothing in sight seems absurd. The absurdity of Hilbert's Hotel is essentially a matter of linguistic surprise. Our intuition struggles with infinity, rather than a logical inconsistency. Now, does that mean an actual infinite past is physically real? We don't know, but physics does not rule it out. Current cosmological models leave it as an open question whether time is finite or if there was something before the Big Bang. There are peer-reviewed models of an eternal universe, for example, cyclic universes, bouncing cosmologies, etc., that are taken seriously. Craig's argument that an infinite regress of causes is impossible is a philosophical assertion that doesn't derive from empirical science. Science's job is to follow evidence, and right now, the evidence is consistent with a universe around 13.8 billion years old, from our Big Bang to the present. However, anything before that, if before even applies, is speculative. Some theories, like eternal inflation or a timeless quantum state, contemplate something without a beginning. There is certainly no empirical proof of a hard t=0 creation from nothing. It's just one possibility. On the other hand, no empirical evidence confirms an actual infinite past. It remains unresolved. The honest position is agnosticism about cosmic infinity, not a dogmatic infinite regress is impossible. The Hilbert's Hotel analogy contributes nothing to resolving this. It's a quirky math example, not a demonstration of physical law. Some scholars have pointed out it's not even clear that Hilbert's hotel is physically impossible. If, hypothetically, the universe were infinite in size or had infinitely many parts, would that violate physics? Not evidently. It would simply mean space or matter is unbounded. We don't observe a Hilbert's hotel in reality, not because it's logically impossible, but likely because the universe, as far as we can see, is finite in observable scope or because such arrangements are impractical. Physics hasn't decreed no infinities. General relativity, for instance, allows for infinite space in some solutions. Quantum theory allows for the existence of actual infinities of states or particles under certain conditions. Think of fields with infinite degrees of freedom. The current scientific consensus, as one analysis put it, is that the spatial finitude of the universe is an open question, so we cannot confidently say actual infinities don't or can't exist in nature. Even if we grant, for the sake of argument, that an infinite past is impossible, the apologist's conclusion still doesn't necessarily follow. If time and causation as we know them break down at the Big Bang, as most physicists think, time is likely emergent and may not extend beyond that point, then asking what came before might be as misguided as asking what's north of the North Pole. It could be that the universe's beginning is an uncaused event in the sense that nothing before it exists. That doesn't sit well with everyday intuition either, but it's on the table of scientific thought. Quantum events don't have causes in the classical sense. If one can accept God exists without cause, it's no more a stretch to say the universe's origin exists without a cause or from quantum fluctuation. The special pleading of everything needs a cause except my favorite entity, God, is laid bare when we realize we could just as well say everything needs a cause except perhaps the universe itself or the multiverse. There's no reason to prefer one exception over the other, except bias. Finally, Hilbert's hotel is often used to put a veneer of logical certainty on the notion that infinite regress leads to contradictions. But that argument has been challenged by philosophers and mathematicians who point out that the supposed contradictions are resolved by careful distinctions. For example, subtracting infinities is not well defined if treated like normal arithmetic, but that's a known fact of transfinite math. It's not a physical contradiction, just an indication that infinity minus infinity is indeterminate, which isn't shocking. It's more a paradox of our language than a proof against reality. Reality isn't obliged to cater to our finite intuitions. Quantum mechanics, for example, is highly counterintuitive, particles behaving like waves, etc. Yet it's real. If an eternal universe or an infinite series of causes is what the cosmos is, it doesn't matter that we find it philosophically puzzling. What matters is evidence. Currently, no evidence justifies ruling out an infinite past confidently. Some cosmologists, like the late Stephen Hawking, proposed models where time is finite but has no boundary, no starting edge, analogous to how the Earth's surface is finite yet has no edge. You can go west indefinitely without a boundary. These models avoid a singular beginning without requiring an infinite temporal regress, a third possibility the apologist ignores. In the end, Hilbert's hotel is a red herring. It's a cute thought experiment that highlights how infinity defies some intuitions about subtraction or occupancy, but it does not demonstrate a real impossibility. The argument from it is neither reliable, since it's not empirical, nor necessary, since physics might sidestep the issue altogether, nor even logical in the sense of showing a contradiction in the concept of an eternal universe. It's primarily used to bolster the Callum cosmological argument. Still, even if Callum's conclusion were right that the universe had a beginning, it's a non sequitur to jump to therefore a personal God caused it. That leap is a separate unwarranted assumption. Even if a first cause exists, why must it be a theistic God with mind and morals, rather than a mindless quantum event? The argument doesn't bridge that gap except by asserting it. Thus, infinite regress arguments, while philosophically interesting, fail to meet the criteria of scientific rigor and do not effectively close the door on naturalistic cosmologies. They certainly don't prove the existence of a deity. At best, they try to show a beginning, but that's a long way from Jesus Christ. A Mystrikal Rebuttal to the Christian Case for God, Part 7 of 14. Is a God outside of time coherent, or just wordplay? To avoid the regress problem, who made God? Apologists claim God is outside of time, timeless, eternal, uncaused. They argue this is coherent and necessary. God, being the creator of time, isn't bound by temporal cause and effect. But labeling God outside time raises a host of logical and conceptual problems. Firstly, What does it mean to exist outside time? Our entire understanding of existence involves duration or sequence, even for abstract objects. We say they exist timelessly only metaphorically. If God is truly atemporal, then God cannot do anything in any temporal sense, because doing is a process, and a process requires time, a before and after. The theist might respond that God is outside time before creation and enters time upon creation. But then God isn't strictly timeless. He just can float in some metaphysical timeless state and then initiate time. This idea becomes self-contradictory. How can a being with no time decide to create a universe at some moment? Decision-making is a temporal concept, intent, followed by action. To claim his timeless, then time starts and his in it is effectively conceding that God had to have some sort of meta-time in which to initiate an act. William Lane Craig himself, after wrestling with this, posited that God is timeless sans creation but temporal since creation, a proposal that many philosophers find ad hoc, and it still doesn't explain how the transition from atemporal to temporal occurs. Even more fundamentally, if God is atemporal and immutable, unchanging, it's hard to see how God can be personal, have thoughts, intentions, or relationships. As philosopher J.R. Lucas observed, to say that God is outside time is to deny, in effect, that God is a person. Why? Because personhood as we know it entails consciousness, which entails a stream of thoughts and experiences, all sequential, hence temporal. A timeless deity could not think one thought after another, respond to changing events, or have an emotional interaction with creatures. Such a deity would be frozen in an eternal, unchanging present. But the God of Scripture is anything but frozen. He creates, he loves, he gets angry, he forgives, and he even changes his mind in some stories. These are temporal actions. So apologists want it both ways. God is outside time, to avoid needing a cause, but also acts in time, to perform miracles, answer prayers, etc. This dual claim veers into incoherence unless one defines it very carefully, and even then, it's highly suspect. If, at the moment of creation, God becomes temporal, then, for all practical purposes, God has a timeline, even if it's not our timeline before creation. And if he is entirely outside time and never enters it, then everything that happens in the universe from our perspective is preordained or set by a timeless decree, which makes a mockery of any interactive relationship. Prayer wouldn't change anything, etc., which ironically some Calvinist theologians accept, but most theists want a God that acts in history. The attempt to call a timeless God coherent often relies on fuzzy analogies. The apologist might say, think of an author outside the timeline of his novel, or a programmer outside the running of a simulation. However, these analogies hurt their case. An author or programmer is still in control. They write or code sequentially in their timeline. Then the story or simulation has its timeline. They are external to the story's timeline, yes, but not external to all time. They inhabit a larger time in which they create. So, if God is analogous to an author, it suggests that God operates in some sort of metatime to make our world's time. That just pushes the issue back. Is there a time above time where God exists? The apologist will usually say no, God's eternal state is not like that, but then the analogy fails. In any case, saying outside time is not an explanation, it's a retreat into mystery. It is admitting we cannot comprehend how God exists or operates, but we assert it anyway. Fine, but then don't claim it's a coherent solution. It's a statement of ignorance dressed as knowledge. Science, by contrast, acknowledges when something is not understood and tries to find answers. In the realm of time and causality, physicists at least propose models that can be analyzed, such as whether time had a beginning or whether time could be emergent from a timeless quantum state. God is outside time isn't a model or hypothesis. It's a metaphysical pronouncement that can't be tested or visualized clearly. As such, it falls far short of the standards of logical clarity and evidentiary support. Even theologians have struggled with the concept of divine eternity for centuries, Boethius, Aquinas, etc. Some say God experiences all times at once, the eternal now, but that raises paradoxes, such as, can such a being truly know what time it is for us right now? If God sees past, present, future all in one gaze, God doesn't experience tensed facts like now it is 2025. However, we find those facts to be very salient. There are arguments in philosophy that a timeless being cannot comprehend tensed reality, which undercuts claims of God's omniscience about the temporal world. Others say God is timeless only in the sense of everlasting, which is just infinite time, not being outside time altogether. Usually, apologists conflate these or gloss over them. The result is a concept that, at best, is extremely nebulous. If we hold theism to the same standard of scrutiny as any theory, we'd press, how exactly does a timeless cause give rise to a temporal effect? The answer tends to be hand-waving or God is omnipotent, he can do it, which is not an answer, but rather a restatement of magic. In a scientific context, to claim something exists outside time and space is to say it is entirely undetectable by any measurement, since all measurements occur in time and space. It means this entity can never be observed, quantified, or scrutinized, which makes the hypothesis effectively meaningless to science. It fails falsifiability completely. Whatever we observe or don't, one could say God did it from outside time, and you could never disprove it, because that God has no defined nature and time to examine. Such an idea does not earn belief by the standards of trustworthy evidence. It's a metaphysical escape hatch invented to protect the concept of God from difficult questions. But in sealing God off from time and causality, it also removes God from the realm of relevance. A truly timeless being cannot logically interact with a temporal world except by stepping into time at some point, which, again, nullifies the original claim of remaining outside time. To illustrate the incoherence, suppose a timeless God creates the universe. Creation is an event. The universe began to exist at some moment. For God to be the agent, he had to bring it about. If God is timeless, then the act of creation isn't something that happened from God's perspective, because no happening can occur without time. So either the universe is co-eternal with God, which defeats the argument that it had an absolute beginning caused by God, or God experienced a change, from not creating to creating, which implies a temporal sequence for God. Some attempt to salvage it by arguing that God's act of creation is atemporal, while its effects are temporal, a mysterious asymmetry that we have no analogy for. This is, frankly, words without meaning to human minds. It's not coherent at all, it's just asserted. In conclusion, the claim God outside of time is coherent is, at best, not demonstrated. It might be coherent only in a thin technical sense, no direct logical contradiction in the phrase timeless person if you don't probe too hard. Still, once you analyze it, it breeds contradictions with the claim that God is personal and active. At worst, it's downright incoherent, as Lucas and Pryor argued in Philosophical Critiques. And importantly, it has no evidential support. It's a concept born out of theological convenience, not one that emerged from observation or necessity in explaining data. When judged by the standards of empirical or logical accountability, it fails. It's neither empirical nor convincingly logical. The atheist stance would rather say, if your concept of God requires contortions like maybe this being exists in a manner we can't even conceptualize properly, doing things that break our understanding of causation, maybe the concept itself is flawed. At the very least, it's not a sound foundation to build proofs of anything. It sounds more like an excuse. Well, God is mysterious, so these issues aren't issues for him. That might comfort a believer, but it doesn't demonstrate anything to a skeptic, except that the believer has essentially moved the goalposts to a realm where no critical inquiry can reach. That's not a strength of the argument. It's a capitulation that rational evaluation cannot support the claim. A Mystrikal Rebuttal to the Christian Case for God, Part 8 of 14. Atheism as blind faith in randomness. The pot calling the kettle black. The apologist's caricature of atheism is that it's just a religion of its own, a blind faith that everything arose by chance and randomness. This is a straw man that betrays a profound misunderstanding of both atheism and science. Atheism, in itself, is not a positive belief system. It's simply the absence of belief in gods. There is no holy doctrine of randomness that atheists recite. What most atheists, being scientifically minded, do accept is that the universe operates by natural laws and processes, many of which are not directed by any mind. That's not blind faith. That's an inference from the evidence that surrounds us. We see order emerging from interactions of matter and energy with no sign of puppeteers behind the scenes. For example, the beautiful complexity of a snowflake emerges from water molecules obeying the impersonal laws of chemistry and thermodynamics, not from a tiny snowflake artisan. Is it faith in randomness to say this? No, it's evidence. We can observe crystal formation in real time. Likewise, when evolutionary biology says mutations are random, It doesn't mean life is pure chaos or chance in the colloquial sense of haphazardness. It means mutations are not directed toward any foreseen goal. They occur due to copying errors or DNA damage, etc., without regard to the organism's needs. But natural selection then non-randomly filters those mutations, a rigorous process that leads to adaptation. So, far from being blind faith in chance, evolution combines random variation with deterministic selection, and this theory has mountains of objective, reproducible evidence, fossil transitions, genetic commonality, observed speciation, etc. There's nothing blind about accepting evolution. We do so because it has met the scientific criteria of explanatory power and is supported by diverse lines of data. Atheists simply extend this methodological naturalism across the board. We have no evidence that anything other than natural processes is needed to explain phenomena, so we don't posit invisible entities. Far from being an act of faith, it's an act of lack of faith, a refusal to believe in things without evidence. The apologist's claim is particularly ironic because faith is a core feature of theism, not atheism. Theists openly talk of having faith in God, believing without seeing, whereas atheism is often about skepticism. I will believe when there is sufficient evidence. Now, the apologist might say, well, you have faith that science will explain everything eventually, you have faith in naturalism. However, this is a misuse of the word faith. Trusting in the scientific method is not the same as religious faith. It's trust based on track record. Science has progressively explained more and more, so it's reasonable to expect it can continue to answer more questions. But crucially, if tomorrow some phenomenon robustly defied natural explanation and consistently pointed to supernatural agency, science-minded people would change their view. There's no dogma forbidding the acceptance of a God. There's just a lack of compelling evidence for any. So atheism isn't a fixed creed. It's a provisional stance. Show good evidence, and the stance shifts. That's the opposite of blind faith, which holds beliefs regardless of evidence. In practice, atheists simply say, we don't know yet how X happened, but we have confidence that using reason and evidence, we might find out. Until then, we won't assume a magical answer. That's not faith in randomness, it's confidence in the empirical process. Another angle, apologists often portray the naturalistic worldview as everything is random, meaningless chaos, by accident. But that's a caricature. The universe has a lot of order. That's why we can do science. We discover regularities, laws of physics, that are remarkably consistent and reliable. That's not randomness, that's structure. True, we don't see intentional purpose behind natural laws. They just are. But admitting we don't see an external purpose is not blind faith in chaos. It's an honest recognition of reality's neutrality. A rock falls due to gravity, not because it means to fall or because spirits tug it. Is it faith to say no invisible spirit pushed the rock, just gravity? No, it's based on experiments demonstrating gravity. Similarly, quantum physics has intrinsic randomness, like an atom decaying at an unpredictable time. Is it faith to accept that, or is it following evidence from cloud chamber tracks and particle detector data? Obviously, the latter. The apologist here might be using randomness as a smear word to imply that atheists think everything is just chance with no rhyme or reason. But atheists and scientists acknowledge cause and effect and natural order. We simply don't attribute it to a deity. Natural laws govern the order we observe. The randomness we see, quantum indeterminacy, genetic variation, is itself a part of those laws. None of this requires faith. It requires acceptance of empirical findings. Meanwhile, consider the theistic alternative. The theist believes an invisible mind speaks universes into existence, suspends natural laws at will to perform miracles, and listens to your thoughts to judge you later. If one is going to accuse anyone of blind faith, it would be hard not to point to those beliefs. At least science-based beliefs are grounded in publicly verifiable evidence. In contrast, religious beliefs are often based on authority, scripture, and subjective experience. The apologist's attempt to level the playing field by saying atheism is just faith too is a rhetorical ploy to dodge the fact that theism is the one asking us to accept huge claims without proof. Atheism is essentially saying, I don't buy that, I'll wait for proof. That's not a leap of faith, it's a demand for reason. Finally, calling it faith in randomness misses that atheism isn't a positive assertion. I know everything happened by chance. An atheist doesn't claim to have ultimate answers to why the universe exists or how life began. beyond current scientific theories. We are comfortable saying we don't know fully, but not knowing something is no reason to insert gods. If someone wants to call that faith in the unknown, they are twisting words. It's not believing in an unknown as an answer. It's simply not pretending to have an answer until we find one. It's the theist who is uncomfortable with "I don't know" and jumps in with "it must be God," which is a form of blind leap. So the accusation is profoundly hypocritical. The phrase blind faith in randomness is an oxymoron. Faith implies belief without evidence. Recognizing randomness is based on evidence that, at fundamental levels, outcomes are probabilistic. No faith is needed, just acceptance of the data. In summary, atheism involves inference and probabilistic reasoning based on evidence, rather than faith. The apologist might label any trust in science or logical consistency as faith, but that's a semantic game. That trust is continually validated by results. Aeroplanes fly, medicines work, computers compute, all thanks to science. If that's faith, it's a far cry from believing ancient holy books sans evidence. Thus, the charge of blind faith boomerangs. It's the theistic worldview that encourages belief without, and sometimes against, evidence, whereas the atheistic, naturalistic worldview explicitly holds beliefs tentative, contingent on proof, and rejects claims that don't meet standards of evidence and falsifiability. No amount of hand-waving about randomness will change that fundamental difference. The apologist here is attacking a straw man, a cartoon atheist who supposedly thinks a tornado hitting a junkyard can assemble a 747, to use the old creationist trope. Real atheists don't believe that either. Complexity emerges through non-random, law-like processes. Again, natural selection is key to biological complexity. In the end, calling atheism a faith is just an attempt to drag it down to the level of religion, so that the apologist can say, "See, everyone has faith. My faith is just in God instead of nothing." But scientific empiricism is not a faith, it's the opposite of faith. It demands to be shown, not told. The apologist who equates the two is either confused or hoping the audience doesn't notice the false equivalence. A Mystrikal Rebuttal to the Christian Case for God, Part 9 of 14. Christianity as an intellectually robust worldview. Is God did it really diligent? The apologist bristles at the notion that invoking God is intellectual laziness, insisting that Christianity involves deep philosophical thought and is not a science stopper. It's true that throughout history, many brilliant minds were Christian and did excellent work. The apologist will happily list them. But the issue isn't whether Christians can be intellectual, it's whether the act of positing God as an explanation tends toward intellectual complacency. And unfortunately, often it does. When faced with a tricky question, say, what caused the universe, or why do humans have a moral sense? Answering, well, God did it provides no details, no mechanism, and no further investigatory path. It's a bit like answering every unknown in a crossword with the word mystery. It fills the space but solves nothing. By contrast, a scientific mindset treats the unknown as a problem to be broken down and explored step by step, potentially over decades, until it is understood. Indeed, in practice, invoking God has frequently functioned as an intellectual dead end. Historically, whenever people attributed something to divine agency, research into that area stalled or was suppressed. Why investigate what causes disease if you accept illness is a punishment from God or demonic possession? Why investigate the weather if you assume it's the whim of the gods or the result of human sin? The label intellectual laziness is provocative, but consider, if one truly believes God upholds every facet of nature according to his inscrutable will, then probing into nature might even be seen as impasse. This was indeed an attitude at certain times, that trying to explain miracles or divine action was wrong. It took a shift in mindset, that nature operates primarily according to its natural laws, set by God, some early scientists believed, offer science to flourish. Once scientists started assuming no ad hoc divine meddling, they uncovered natural explanations. And every time someone had been tempted to say, this phenomenon has no natural explanation, it must be God, and then later found the natural cause, it showcased how prematurely invoking God can short-circuit inquiry. The anecdote of Laplace telling Napoleon he had no need of that hypothesis, God, in his celestial mechanics is a classic example. Newton thought God's occasional intervention was needed to keep the solar system stable, but Laplace's meticulous work showed that gravitational interactions alone were sufficient. If Laplace had just deferred to Newton's theological answer, he might not have discovered the perturbation equations that solved it. Curiosity shuts down when you think you have a final answer. Invoking God is often regarded as a definitive solution. The apologist might counter, "No, Christianity encourages inquiry. We're thinking God's thoughts after him," to quote Kepler. It's not lazy to believe in an orderly creator that grounds rational investigation. This is a rose-tinted view. While some individual Christians integrated their faith with scientific exploration, it usually involved compartmentalizing, treating day-to-day research as if God's not going to interfere with the experiment. The actual methodologies that yield discoveries assume natural causes. The moment you start saying, "Maybe God will miraculously change this outcome," you can't do science. The methodological success of even religious scientists stemmed from bracketing their belief in miracles or divine caprice. Those who didn't, who invoked gods for natural events, tended to be left in the dust. For instance, when Pasteur proposed that germs cause disease, many in the religious establishment resisted because it clashed with the idea that disease might be divine punishment or a test of faith. One had to let go of the divine explanation to embrace the microbial one, which of course led to much more helpful, testable knowledge and saved lives. Another aspect is that Christianity often provides easy answers for existential and ethical questions, which can sometimes bypass nuanced thinking. Why are we here? Because God made us for a purpose. That's an answer, but one that avoids wrestling with the complexity of reality, such as the fact that we are one species among millions, products of evolution, etc. Where does consciousness come from? God gave us a soul. That's a quick answer requiring no research into neuroscience. It's intellectually easier to posit a transcendent agent than to unravel natural mechanisms, which can be arduous and humbling. In that sense, yes, it's a form of intellectual shortcut. It might be emotionally satisfying, but it doesn't increase knowledge. It just stops the questioning with mystery solved by miracle. Real intellectual rigor often means embracing uncertainty and painstakingly finding answers. God did it bypasses the uncertainty by assertive fiat. To be fair, not all Christians are scientific sluggards. Many do great science, but notably they are not using God did it in their scientific reasoning. They operate as de facto naturalists in the lab. The conflict typically arises when someone insists on God as an explanation in fields that are still under investigation, such as the origin of life and consciousness, effectively saying, "We'll never understand this naturally, so let's not bother. Just accept it's God." That is the lazy stance being critiqued. It was seen with intelligent design proponents who, rather than researching to find how a complex organ evolved, would point and say, "Too complex. Must be designed." A scientific dead end that produced no new knowledge, just doubt. Scientists who didn't take the easy way out kept digging and often found plausible natural paths for complexity. Furthermore, saying Christianity is intellectually robust because it has theologians and philosophers who debate fine points of doctrine doesn't impress on the evidence front. Yes, one can get a PhD in theology and write dense books, but if it's all about interpreting ancient texts and abstract attributes of a being whose existence isn't independently verified, it can become an exercise in debating how many angels fit on a pinhead. Without tethering to evidence, intellectual vigor can easily turn into sophistry, clever arguments built on questionable premises. It can undoubtedly be intellectually complex, but complexity isn't the same as correctness or rigor. Astrologers can have an elaborate system that requires a lot of thought, but it's not aligned with reality. The ultimate measure of an explanation's intellectual merit in the scientific sense is how well it aligns with empirical facts and whether it propels deeper understanding that can be tested. By that measure, God falls flat. It's static. God's always the ultimate answer by definition, so it doesn't lead to new, testable questions, and it's insulated from correction. Any contradictory evidence can be rationalized as God works in mysterious ways or testing God is impasse. That approach is an intellectual cul-de-sac. It may involve a lot of wordplay and reasoning within its assumptions, but it doesn't progress. Richard Dawkins bluntly called the God explanation a cop-out, saying that invoking an unexplained God to answer things is an evasion of the responsibility to explain. He argues scientists would say we're working on it rather than God did it. Stop asking. Indeed, to prematurely claim a final answer, God, is to close off discussion and further inquiry. The theist may respond that they do continue to inquire, but notice, when inquiry continues, it remains within the realm of seeking natural mechanisms. If a Christian doctor prays for a patient and also prescribes antibiotics, It's the antibiotic, based on scientific inquiry, that does the heavy lifting. If a problem is left to God's will, no progress occurs until someone approaches it naturalistically. This demonstrates that while one can believe in God and still be intellectually curious, the curiosity is productive only when it operates on secular principles. The moment you rest on God's will or design, you've effectively exited the road of discovery for a comfortable parking spot of assumed knowledge. Thus, the criticism of intellectual laziness isn't a personal insult. There are very intelligent theists, but a critique of a method, stopping at a supernatural assertion rather than pushing for deeper evidence-based understanding. In science, saying we don't know yet spurs further investigation. Saying we do know, God did it, prematurely ends it. The apologist's multipoint argument exemplifies this. For each unknown or abstract question, the answer God, plus some philosophical dressing, is given. That provides a semblance of completeness, but it's superficial. The real intellectual heavy lifting is deferred. In contrast, a worldview that remains open to following the evidence wherever it leads, even if it leads to we're complicated apes on an average planet, with no divine plan telling us our purpose, requires a lot more intellectual courage and rigor. Constructing meaning and ethics in a naturalistic framework, for instance, takes effort and nuance. You can't just quote a scripture. Understanding consciousness through neuroscience is massively challenging, much more complicated than saying soul. The naturalist doesn't have easy, comforting answers to everything, and that's a motivator to keep learning. The theist has a ready-made answer that can tempt one to complacency. So is Christianity intellectual laziness? It can certainly inspire deep thought in areas such as metaphysics or moral philosophy. Still, when those thoughts begin with an answer, God, and work backwards, they risk confirmation bias and circular reasoning. Metaphysics guided by scripture often starts by assuming what it needs to prove, that a particular God exists and possesses specific attributes. That's not rigorous. That's preloading your conclusions. An intellectually honest approach would begin with what is empirically or logically grounded and only then determine whether any concept of a God is necessary. So far, it hasn't been necessary. This is why many thinkers see theistic explanations as superfluous at best. They often hinder further thought by creating an illusion of understanding God's plan, where we might otherwise investigate causes and effects. In summary, while Christians as individuals can be inquisitive and intelligent, the act of attributing phenomena to God often serves as an intellectual shortcut rather than a rigorous explanation. It's the equivalent of answering a child's every question with "because magic." It stops the why too early. Actual rigor demands going beyond magic, or in theology's case, beyond saying God, to see how things tick. On that count, the habit of mind that appeals to deity doesn't measure up. The sharpest intellectual critique reveals that these God explanations are either vacuous, God did it without mechanism, or raise more questions than they answer. How does a timeless God act? Etc. But then forbid probing those because it's mystery. This is not a virtue in inquiry. Thus, contrary to the apologist's defense, there is a sense in which defaulting to God is a form of intellectual laziness. It refuses to live with unknowns and do the work to find real answers, preferring a canned reply that's immune to evidence. That may be psychologically satisfying, but it's the opposite of the scientific spirit. Relying on faith to fill gaps is easier than doing research, and that, ultimately, is why it's so enticing. A Mystrikal Rebuttal to the Christian Case for God, Part 10 of 14. Metaphysics and the Grounding of Intelligibility, Grand Claims Without Ground. The apologist's final salvo is the idea that without the proper metaphysical foundation, intelligibility itself wouldn't be possible. Often, this is a riff on the presuppositionalist argument, which posits that logic, science, and reason can only make sense if we assume a particular metaphysics, usually Christian theism, at the outset. They claim atheists borrow from the Christian worldview just to have rationality, laws of logic, uniformity of nature, etc., because supposedly only God can guarantee those. This argument is bold and completely baseless. It amounts to an assertion that unless their philosophy is true, we couldn't even think straight or trust reality, which is a textbook case of begging the question. They assume what they need to prove, that a God-based metaphysics is underpinning everything. Let's examine specifics. One form of this claim is that only God's existence guarantees the uniformity of nature, that tomorrow will be like today, that induction works. But this is ironic, because if anything, invoking a miracle-working God undermines the uniformity of nature. Science proceeds on the assumption that no malicious demon or capricious deity will arbitrarily append the experiment results. The early scientists, like Newton, believed God established the laws but then mostly refrained from nullifying them, except maybe rare miracles. In effect, they presumed a deistic or, at the very least, a law-abiding God, not one that constantly intervenes. If anything, naturalism provides a more straightforward expectation of uniformity. The universe has no hidden personal agenda. It simply operates on consistent principles. Why is water boiling at 100 degrees Celsius today and likely to do so tomorrow? Not because God is at each moment deciding to make it so, but because of stable physical properties. If it were God's free choice, he could change it whenever. Only a guarantee of no such whimsical changes gives us confidence. The theist will say, "Oh, but God's nature is unchanging goodness, so he wouldn't deceive us with chaos." Yet this is an extra assumption piled on. You have to trust that God, if he exists, prefers a law-like cosmos and no deception. We have evidence that the cosmos is largely law-like without invoking God. To a neutral observer, the success of induction is just a brute fact. Maybe it's metaphysically necessary for any intelligible world, or perhaps if it weren't true, we wouldn't be here to notice anthropic reasoning. Positing God to guarantee it is adding an unnecessary layer. It's like saying, we need Thor to ensure gravity keeps working. No, we observe gravity working and have equations for it. Adding Thor adds nothing but an unfounded assurance that if something weird happened, Thor would fix it. Another aspect. Laws of logic and reason. Presuppositionalists claim these are features of God's mind. So without God, logic would be just human convention. This is not convincing. Atheistic philosophers have extensively analyzed logic and mathematics without invoking God, finding them either abstract truths that hold in any possible world or grounded in linguistic conventions and neuronal patterns. None of those analyses require a deity. The idea that atheists can't account for logic is just empty rhetoric. We use logic because it works to generate non-contradictory conclusions about reality. Why does it work? Possibly because any universe where A and not A could both be true in the same sense would be unintelligible and unstable. Such universes don't produce rational beings or coherent experiences. So either only universes following logical consistency spawn observers, anthropic principle again, or logic is simply part of the framework of reality, with no need for further explanation. To say God accounts for logic is to push the question back. Does God follow logic because it's good, or is logic sound because God follows it? This mirrors the earlier Euthyphro dilemma for morality. If logic is part of God's nature, that still doesn't tell us why logic holds. It just asserts that God's mind is logical. We could just as well assert the structure of reality is logical, and cut out the middleman. There is nothing self-contradictory or unintelligible about a universe without God. If the apologist disagrees, they should point to an actual logical law or necessary truth that only holds if God exists. None has ever been demonstrated. It's always an assertion. Well, if there's no absolute, you can't have absolutes like logic. Why not? Perhaps logic is the absolute. Or nature's regularity is the brute given. They never justify why their absolute, a divine being, is needed, instead of simply stating that reality has certain absolute features. Usually, it comes down to because my holy book says so, which is hardly a neutral proof. Regarding metaphysics and its grounding of intelligibility in general, it's worth noting that people with vastly different metaphysical worldviews can communicate, engage in science, and act rationally. An atheist, a Hindu, and a Christian can all understand a geometry proof or agree on experimental results. This strongly suggests that intelligibility doesn't depend on accepting one metaphysical doctrine. It depends on some shared fundamental presuppositions, such as the existence of a consistent reality, our ability to perceive it roughly correctly, and the validity of logic. Those are philosophical axioms or epistemic principles, not the sole property of any religion. The apologist might refer to those axioms as metaphysics, but they are minimal and don't require a theistic interpretation. If anything, these are common-sense presumptions that even infants and animals use. Animals operate as if the world is stable enough to find food and avoid predators. They have an implicit trust in some uniformity and causality, no theology degree needed. We refine these assumptions through science. For example, learning where our intuitions go wrong, such as at the quantum scale or in relativity. But none of that invokes God. The phrase preconditions of intelligibility is thrown around as if a magic spell. Only God provides the preconditions of intelligibility. But when pressed for why, presuppositionalists often end up circular. Because without God, you couldn't prove anything, as only God makes logic reliable. And how do we know God exists? Because otherwise we couldn't prove anything. It's a sophist's trick, not a sound argument. They are asserting necessity without demonstrating it. Meanwhile, naturalists have a much simpler explanation. The universe appears intelligible because if it weren't at least somewhat intelligible, we would not have evolved as reasoning beings. Only in a relatively law-like universe can information and cognition arise. So we find ourselves in such a universe. No wonder. This is a kind of modest anthropic reasoning combined with evolution. Does this prove why nature is uniform? Not exactly, but it gives a plausible account that doesn't assume what it's trying to prove. And it's undoubtedly more parsimonious than positing an entire deity to do the work. Another component is morality or meaning. Sometimes, metaphysics for intelligibility includes claims like without God, no objective morality or meaning, so nothing matters or makes sense. This is more of an emotional appeal than a logical one. People derive meaning from many sources, relationships, pursuits, beauty, and so on, without invoking a deity. Morality can be reasoned and felt through empathy and social understanding, as discussed earlier, without needing stone tablets from above. Life making sense is a subjective judgment. Plenty of atheists find their life perfectly meaningful, intelligible in terms of cause and effect, and also rich in purpose, self-chosen or stemming from natural desires to flourish. So, existence doesn't plunge into unintelligible absurdity without God. That's a theist myth often used to scare believers from even considering a godless worldview. Without God, everything collapses into chaos. Look around. In predominantly secular countries, people still obey laws, conduct scientific research, love their families, and find happiness. Reality doesn't disintegrate if fewer people pray. Intelligibility is robust without reference to God. In the realm of actual scholarly philosophy, the idea that you need God to validate logic or induction is a fringe claim held by certain religious philosophers, not a consensus. The consensus, if one can speak of it, is that logic stands on its axioms. Induction is a habit of mind justified pragmatically by its success. Some invoke probability. Some say it's ultimately something we accept without full proof. But that's Hume's problem of induction, and invoking God doesn't solve Hume's problem either. You'd have to assume God's consistency, which is the same issue at one remove. The apologist's claim is not only unproven but also out of step with mainstream philosophical thought. It fails the relevance test. 2. How does positing God help us solve any logical or scientific problem? When doing math, do we invoke God to justify that modus ponens works? No, we just use modus ponens, and everyone gets it. The metaphysical grounding talk is fluff that doesn't alter how we practice reasoning. Moreover, even if one felt some metaphysical grounding was needed, why specifically Christianity? Why not deism, just a creator who sets up logic and leaves? Why not a pantheistic view that the universe itself is divine and rational? The apologist will likely have no answer beyond special pleading that their scripture reveals it. But someone could equally claim the precondition for intelligibility is the Tao, or Brahman, or any ultimate principle that implies order. Without independent evidence, choosing the Christian God is arbitrary. The argument at heart is, for anything to make sense, an ultimate intelligible principle must exist. I call it God. Therefore, God exists. But this doesn't tell you anything about Jesus or biblical reliability or salvation. It's just a warmed-over Aristotelian idea of a prime intellect. They smuggle in all of Christian doctrine on the back of a generic necessity argument. That is hardly sound. To illustrate the emptiness, one Christian forum member ironically noted, the preconditions for intelligibility are language and logic. If you believe in God, that belief will not help you understand what a book is saying. To understand a book, you need to know the language. The belief in God is irrelevant to that process. This nails it. No matter what metaphysics you hold, you still have to go through the same steps of learning and reasoning. Theist or atheist, you use logic, you trust your senses, with caution, you assume some regularity. Those are human universals of cognition, not gifts reserved for Christians. So when the apologist claims their metaphysics is necessary, they are committing the fallacy of arrogance, equating their worldview with the only possible foundation for rational thought. It's an assertion meant to dismiss alternatives without engaging them. But as we've shown, naturalism and secular philosophy have perfectly serviceable accounts for knowledge and reasoning, maybe not perfectly philosophically airtight. Philosophy rarely gets absolutes. Still, neither is the theists, they just outsource the mystery to God. If something is currently mysterious, like why logic exists at all, saying God's nature is not an answer, it's just restating the mystery in different terms. We could also say, logical truths are part of the universe's nature. Full stop. The theist hasn't demonstrated any contradiction or insufficiency in that statement. They just prefer to add God. In conclusion, the claim that without theistic metaphysics nothing is intelligible is grandiose and unfounded. It fails to meet the bar of logical demonstration. No contradiction in assuming a godless yet orderly universe has been shown. And it certainly fails evidentially. We see order and intelligibility every day without invoking miracles. Intelligibility is grounded in the consistent patterns of reality and the cognitive faculties we evolved, neither of which inherently requires a deity. The apologist is essentially saying, I can't see how you can justify thinking unless you think like me, which is more a lack of imagination on their part than a proof. When examined critically, each necessary claim is revealed to be merely asserted, not demonstrated. The world remains coherent and comprehensible without needing to posit unobservable divine underpinnings. It's more coherent without adding that extra layer, because then we don't have to explain the complexities and contradictions that the concept of God itself introduces. A Mystrikal Rebuttal to the Christian Case for God, Part 11 of 14. Are the Gospels reliable? Eyewitness testimony under the microscope. The apologist typically argues that the New Testament Gospels are historically reliable accounts, often claiming they are based on eyewitness testimony and therefore trustworthy reports of Jesus' life, miracles, and resurrection. This needs to be measured against accepted standards of historical methodology. When historians assess a document, they ask, who wrote it and when? From what sources? Does the author have biases? How does it align or conflict with other accounts? Are there external confirmations, archaeology, contemporary records? On virtually all these counts, the Gospels raise red flags rather than confidence. Authorship and date. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written anonymously. The familiar names were ascribed by later tradition. Modern biblical scholarship, across a broad spectrum, agrees that none of the Gospels was written by an eyewitness who walked with the historical Jesus. They were written 40 to 70 years after Jesus' death, in a language, Greek, that Jesus and his Aramaic-speaking disciples likely didn't write. Even the Gospel of John, traditionally attributed to the apostle, shows signs of multiple hands and a much later theological outlook, end of the 1st century. The current consensus of critical scholars, including many devout ones, is that the Gospels are not eyewitness documents but compilations of oral and perhaps earlier written sources, shaped by evangelists for theological goals. For example, the Gospel of Luke openly states that he wasn't an eyewitness but gathered accounts, Luke 1 verse 1-4. Suppose we approach them like any other ancient biographies. In that case, we must note, they were written decades later, by unknown authors, in a highly religious context, to preach the good news rather than neutrally recording facts. This doesn't make them worthless, but it means they cannot be taken at face value as journalistic reports. They are secondary sources at best, not primary eyewitness accounts, and they show the characteristics of folklore and legend development, increasingly supernatural events, for example, as you go from Mark to John. Internal contradictions. If multiple eyewitnesses independently testify to an event, we expect some minor discrepancies but overall agreement on core facts. What do we see in the Gospels? We see significant differences and even flat contradictions among them on key events. Compare, for instance, the resurrection narratives. Who went to the tomb? One account says one woman, Mary Magdalene, went alone, another says she went with another Mary, and another mentions multiple women, including Salome and Joanna. What did they see? Matthew says an angel came down and rolled the stone away with a great earthquake. Mark and Luke say the stone was already rolled away, and they saw young men or angels inside. John says Mary found it empty, and later 2 angels appeared after Peter and John visited. Who did Jesus first appear to, and where? Matthew, to women near the tomb and then to the disciples on a mountain in Galilee. Luke, only in the vicinity of Jerusalem, to 2 on Emmaus Road, then to the 11 in a room, explicitly stating the disciples stayed in Jerusalem until Pentecost, which conflicts with Matthew's scene in Galilee. In John, Jesus appears in Jerusalem, then later by the Sea of Galilee. These are not trivial details. The accounts can't all be true simultaneously. A historian faced with such divergent narratives recognizes the telltale signs of legend and mythography rather than precise memory. True eyewitnesses rarely contradict each other on where and when something happened if it was observed. The differences here indicate that the stories were passed through decades of oral tradition, likely evolving separately in different Christian communities, some centered in Jerusalem, others in Galilee, etc., before being recorded. This undermines reliability, at least if by reliable we mean accurate history. They are reliable in conveying the beliefs of early Christians, perhaps, but not necessarily the facts of events. Bias and genre. The Gospels are religious texts that aim to convince readers of Jesus' divine identity. John's Gospel even states its purpose bluntly, that you may believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. John 20 verse 31. This evangelistic motive means the authors weren't neutral reporters. They were propagating faith. In ancient historical methods, we prefer sources that have no vested interest in the claims they make. Here, the authors do. They are partisans of the new Christian movement. Moreover, the genre of the Gospels is not straightforward history. They blend biography with theological discourse, allegory, as seen in Jesus' parables and possibly in how episodes are framed, and fulfillment of prophecy narratives that sometimes supersede literal chronology or fact. For instance, Matthew often inserts events to fulfill prophecy, such as Jesus' family going to Egypt, so that out of Egypt I called my son could be applied, a pious motive rather than a historical one, since other Gospels don't mention those events. This shows the Gospel writers freely shaped narratives to fit theological points. A critical historian must thus take each story with a grain of salt and corroborate it independently if possible. Lack of external corroboration. One glaring issue is that most of the miraculous or significant events in Jesus' story have no attestation outside Christian sources of a later date. For example, at Jesus' death, Matthew claims that there were 3 hours of darkness over the whole land and an earthquake, and even the dead saints rose from their tombs and walked around Jerusalem. Matthew 27 verses 45 and 51 to 53. These would have been astonishing occurrences. One would think someone else might have noted midday darkness or a mass resurrection. Yet no contemporary observer in or around Judea records anything of the sort. Roman historians, local writers such as Philo of Alexandria, who was alive at the time and wrote about Pilate's tenure, but never mentions Jesus or cosmic portents, and others remain silent. This absence is telling. It doesn't prove that nothing happened, but by historical reasoning, if something as public as a daytime eclipse or a wide-scale zombie event occurred, at least one chronicler besides later Christians would likely have mentioned it. Their silence is evidence of absence, in the sense that these extraordinary claims likely would leave some trace, and they don't. The apologist might respond that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That cliché is partly true. Just because we haven't found evidence doesn't mean something didn't happen. However, historians weigh prior probability and expected evidence. If a story claims something that, if true, should have left evidence, like multiple independent reports, archaeological impact, etc., then not finding any corroboration does count against it. In other words, if an event is of a type that normally leaves footprints, and we see none, we become rightly skeptical. For mundane events, a rabbi gave a sermon on a mount, not being recorded elsewhere isn't surprising. However, for monumental events, sun darkened, temple veil torn, earthquakes, it is suspicious that only the later religious texts mention them. Even for the existence and basic deeds of Jesus, the contemporary evidence is lacking. The earliest writings we have are Paul's epistles, 20 years after Jesus. Paul barely mentions Jesus' earthly life at all. He's focused on the theological Christ and resurrection. The Gospels come a generation or two after the events they describe. There is no known writing from Pilate, or the Sanhedrin, or any witness outside the circle of believers. The famous mention of Jesus in Josephus's Antiquities was written around 93 AD, and parts of it are likely interpolated by later Christians. Tacitus, around 115 AD, references Christ's execution in passing, likely repeating what Christians of his time were saying. These are not eyewitness accounts, just second-hand. This means that, from a historical perspective, all accounts of Jesus' miracles are filtered through the beliefs of believers. There's no neutral or hostile source from the 30s AD saying, a faith healer is causing a stir. Contrast this with someone like Apollonius of Tyana, a contemporary miracle worker, who at least had some contemporary writings, though they too are hagiographic. Or take a modern analogy. If only members of Scientology ever wrote about L. Ron Hubbard and we had nothing from outside, we'd be cautious in accepting their glowing narratives. That's the situation with the Gospels, except with a time gap. Eyewitness quality. The apologist might claim the disciples were eyewitnesses and died for their beliefs, so that they wouldn't die for a lie. But dying for belief only shows sincerity, not the truth of the belief. People of many religions have died for things we consider false. The disciples could genuinely have believed they saw the risen Jesus. The question is what happened to them. Psychology has ample cases of visions, hallucinations, or groupthink in religious contexts. After a beloved leader's death, followers sometimes report visions, for example, visions of Muhammad after he died, or spiritualists contacting the dead. In an age without modern science, experiences like dreams or internal voices could be taken as real appearances. Paul's encounter with Jesus was a vision, a light and a voice from heaven. Acts describes it, and Paul hints in his letters that it was not a flesh and blood meeting. The Gospels later flesh out physical appearances, but note that the earliest Gospel, Mark, ends with no appearances in its original form. Mark 16 verse 8 concludes with the empty tomb and the women in fear. The appearances in Mark are found in later added verses. Matthew, next, has a relatively brief encounter in Galilee. Luke expands with multiple appearances and eating fish to prove tangibility, and John goes even further, doubting Thomas touching wounds, etc. The story grows in detail. A historian views this trajectory as typical of legend development, starting from perhaps a simple claim, such as we saw Jesus in a vision or spiritual form, to later narratives of concrete interactions designed to convince skeptics of a bodily resurrection. That doesn't instill confidence that these are verbatim eyewitness accounts. Instead, they appear to be theological narratives shaped to make a point that Jesus truly rose bodily. Another sign of legendary development: differences in genealogies of Jesus, Matthew versus Luke. Both can't be historically correct. One or both are constructed for theological reasons. The nativity stories conflict. The timing of Jesus' birth relative to Quirinius' census versus Herod's reign is off by a decade. These inconsistencies suggest that at least some parts of the story were not preserved via meticulous eyewitness memory, but instead created or adapted. Professional historians thus treat the Gospels as valuable sources for what early Christians believed, but they must be corroborated for specifics. When the apologist simply declares them reliable because of a traditional belief that apostles wrote them or because of supposed eyewitness quality, they are ignoring a century of critical scholarship. Indeed, many Christian scholars acknowledge these issues. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops' commentary notes that the attribution of Matthew's Gospel to the Apostle Matthew is likely not historical, given that Matthew copies extensively from Mark, who wasn't an eyewitness. It's hardly likely an actual disciple would need to borrow from someone who wasn't there. The consensus referenced, scholars generally agree that the Gospels were written 40 to 60 years after the death of Jesus. They thus do not present eyewitness or contemporary accounts. That is a mainstream view, not some fringe skeptic rant. Even the famed New Testament scholar and skeptic, Bart Ehrman, states bluntly, eyewitnesses do not write them, the authors never identify themselves, and they circulated for decades before anyone claimed they were by those people, Matthew, etc. This is important. If no one even claimed these specific attributions until a century later, then the eyewitness label is an orthodox tradition, not a demonstrable fact. Historical methodology also prefers multiple independent sources for extraordinary events. For the resurrection, what are our sources? Just the Christian testimony, 4 Gospels which are not fully independent, 3 are synoptics with literary dependence. Matthew and Luke use Mark. John is somewhat independent but late and theologically heavy. Plus Paul's letters summarizing a list of appearances, 1 Corinthians 15, which doesn't even align perfectly with Gospel accounts. Paul mentions Jesus appearing to over 500 brethren at once, which no Gospel describes, a striking omission if it happened, suggesting perhaps that detail was a later legend or something Paul heard that didn't make it into narrative tradition. We have no writings from any neutral party saying the tomb was found empty, or I saw Jesus alive after his execution. We only have believers saying so, primarily decades later. That is very weak evidence by typical historical standards, especially for an unprecedented claim like a resurrection. A general rule, often attributed to David Hume, is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. A handful of internally inconsistent, agenda-driven documents do not qualify as extraordinary evidence. If we were talking about a mundane claim, Jesus took a trip to Capernaum, we'd be more lenient. But a man rising from the dead after 3 days, that's huge. Yet the evidence is of the sort we find for legendary events in ancient literature, not thoroughly documented contemporary records. We also must consider the possibility of legendary accrual. It's entirely plausible historically that Jesus of Nazareth was a real preacher who was crucified, and that some of his followers had experiences, grief hallucinations, visions, or spiritual insights, leading them to believe he was exalted to heaven. This then evolved into stories of an empty tomb and physical appearances as the tale was retold, especially as it spread to Gentile communities that put less stock in Jewish notions of spiritual resurrection and wanted tangible proof. None of this requires deceit. It's the natural evolution of story and belief in an era where oral tradition was primary and people were predisposed to see divine portents. The apologist may refer to that scenario as blind faith in randomness again. Still, it draws on how human psychology and social dynamics work, which is evidence-based. We know that urban legends grow, memory distorts, and visions occur, etc. It's far more plausible under historical reasoning than the alternative that a deity literally raised someone and carefully left evidence only in the hands of believers. Suppose the resurrection was a one-time literal event in history. In that case, it's pretty odd that God didn't arrange a single impartial witness or a preserved neutral document, instead relying solely on those who already believed or were part of the movement. That pattern aligns more closely with human storytelling than with a divine plan. Archaeology and history have, if anything, challenged some biblical assertions. For instance, the Gospel of Luke's mention of a worldwide census under Augustus, where everyone had to return to their ancestral hometown, Luke 2 verse 1-3, is regarded as historically dubious. Romans did censuses for taxation, but there's no record of an empire-wide census requiring travel to ancestral homes. That's enormously impractical. Quirinius conducted a census of Judea once, in 6 AD, but that wouldn't have affected Galilee, where Joseph and Mary lived, and occurred long after Herod the Great's death in 4 BC. Yet, Luke links Jesus' birth to Herod's reign, creating a contradiction in the timeline. Apologists have tried harmonizing, but professional historians largely see this as Luke's attempt to place Jesus' birth in Bethlehem via a contrived scenario, which is historically problematic. The absence of Roman records confirming Luke's peculiar census suggests Luke's account isn't reliable reporting, but a literary device to fulfill the prophecy of a Messiah from Bethlehem. This doesn't disprove Jesus' birth, obviously not. Still, it shows gospel writers were willing to play loose with facts for narrative or theological reasons, again undermining blind trust in their reliability. When confronted, the apologist often says, the absence of archaeological evidence doesn't disprove that it happened. Sure, but it does remove one possible support. And suppose multiple such things, census, massacre of the infants by Herod, for which we also have no evidence outside Matthew's Gospel and which the meticulous historian Josephus strangely omits in his detailed catalogue of Herod's crimes, lack evidence. In that case, the cumulative case for caution grows. Miracle reports from antiquity are not unique to Christianity. Historians approach them all with skepticism. They are accounts of healers, apparitions, oracles, and other supernatural entities across cultures. The standard historical method doesn't say, take the most well-attested miracle and believe it, because, by nature, miracles violate our understanding of how the world works and are not reproducible. Instead, historians might say, people believe this miracle happened, and it had XYZ effects on their community. But whether the miracle truly occurred is beyond the scope of historical demonstration. Bart Ehrman, again, points out that a historian cannot, with the tools of history, prove a miracle, because the historian deals in probabilities, and by definition, a miracle is the least probable explanation. That's what makes it a miracle. This doesn't mean a miracle never happened. It means that history, as a discipline, can't adjudicate it as the most likely event. If 500 people claimed to see Jesus alive, a historian could say 500 people claimed this. But to conclude, therefore, he definitely was supernaturally raised is to go beyond historical inference to a faith assertion. Ehrman famously stated, miracles by their nature are inherently improbable, so a historian can never conclude a miracle probably occurred. William Lane Craig complained about that, but it's a basic principle of methodological naturalism in history. We can say the early Christians had experiences they interpreted as appearances of Jesus. That's a historical fact. But whether an actual resurrected body was present is a matter of belief, not provable by historical critical methods. All the more so given the scant and conflicting evidence. If a court of law had 4 witnesses with the gospel discrepancies, plus only enthusiastic supporters and no neutral testimony, the defense would have a field day highlighting the contradictions and lack of cross-examined evidence. It wouldn't meet beyond a reasonable doubt, maybe not even preponderance, depending on one's view. Therefore, while the apologist might want to hold the Gospels aloft as reliable and eyewitness-backed, the reality is that by modern standards of historical research, they must be treated cautiously. They preserve a core proclamation that followers believed Jesus was risen and was the Messiah, but the details around that proclamation are fuzzy and colored by decades of theological reflection. Ultimately, believing in their accounts, especially the miraculous elements, is an act of faith, not a conclusion compelled by historical evidence. And acknowledging this is simply being honest about the nature of the sources. It doesn't mean dismissing everything they say. They likely get many mundane details of first-century Palestine right, which archaeology sometimes confirms, such as place names or political figures. Still, it means that on the key claims that matter to Christian apologetics, divinity, miracles, resurrection, the evidence is nowhere near the quality one would need to verify such claims scientifically or historically. A Mystrikal Rebuttal to the Christian Case for God, Part 12 of 14. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, except when it is, provisionally. When cornered about the lack of corroboration for biblical events, such as the absence of archaeological evidence for some episodes or no contemporary records of Jesus' wonders, apologists often remind us that the lack of evidence isn't definitive proof that the event didn't happen. True, one can't prove a negative in many cases. However, this maxim is often misused. In historical investigation, the absence of expected evidence is evidence of absence. It's not absolute proof, but it tilts the probability towards probably didn't happen that way. For example, we have no archaeological evidence for millions of Israelites wandering in the Sinai desert for 40 years, the Exodus. Given the size of that group and its duration, one would expect to find at least some traces in the material record. Archaeologists have looked and not found what would anticipate, campsites, remains, etc. That absence, combined with what we know about population and settlement patterns from Egyptian and Canaanite records, strongly suggests that the Exodus as described in the Bible is not a literal historical event. Professional archaeologists, including devout Jewish and Christian scholars, have largely viewed it as a myth or, at most, a small-scale event that was later magnified. The apologist might say, maybe evidence will be found tomorrow, which is technically possible, but at some point, repeated failure to find confirmatory data justifies skepticism. Good historical method works on probability, not certainties. Consider the massacre of the innocents, Herod's killing of Bethlehem's infants in Matthew 2. Herod's brutality is well attested, killing sons, etc., so it's plausible. However, Bethlehem was a small town, perhaps with only a few dozen infants at most, so apologists argue that Josephus or others might not have mentioned a minor incident. That's fair. Absence of mention isn't strong evidence of absence there. It could have happened and just not been recorded outside of Matthew. We weigh it by context. Matthew has a habit of aligning Jesus' life with Moses's. The massacre mirrors Pharaoh's killing of Hebrew infants and Moses' escape. It fits a literary motif. That raises suspicion that it might be invented to portray Jesus as the new Moses. Here, the absence of evidence, combined with internal literary analysis, makes it likely that it's not historical. But it's not a slam dunk. We leave it as uncertain, but leaning towards legendary. Contrast that with bigger claims. The 3-hour darkness at the crucifixion. Suppose that was an eclipse or a dust storm blocking the sun, as seen in Jerusalem. Some apologists suggest it may have been a local phenomenon. In that case, one might expect someone like Philo or Seneca, who catalogued natural events, to note an odd dark midday. We have one later Christian writer, Tertullian, who in the 2nd century claimed that a record of the darkness was in Roman archives. But there's no evidence that such a Roman record existed. Roman historians of the time, Pliny, Seneca, etc., do not mention it. This suggests that the darkness story might be theological, darkness as a sign of judgment, rather than a factual account. Early Christians, eager to validate it, may have spread the idea that pagans recorded it. But if that were true, we should find traces in extant writings, which we don't. So the silence of multiple expected observers is evidence that maybe the darkness didn't literally occur. So, the rule of thumb is the evidence we would expect to find, if the event happened, reasonably likely to have survived or be accessible. If yes, and we find none, that lowers our confidence that the event occurred. If no, the event is small-scale, or records are likely lost, then absence means little. Apologists often act as if no biblical event can be doubted by lack of evidence. Hey, it was long ago, absence doesn't disprove. Which immunizes everything from scrutiny. That's not rational. History is a game of probabilities. We can never 100% disprove that. Say, Jesus walked on water. We note that outside the Gospels, no one mentions it, as it defies physics, and such lake-walking tales are familiar in folklore. Some Buddhist texts also feature monks walking on water. So the probability that he did is extremely low. We can't disprove it, but we don't believe it for the same reason we don't think Apollonius of Tyana raised a dead girl. One source claims he did, or Muhammad split the moon. Islamic tradition holds that he did, yet astronomers of the world noticed nothing. We withhold belief in miraculous claims from antiquity unless we have robust evidence. And unfortunately for the theist, the resurrection, their most cherished miracle, doesn't have extra evidence beyond biased testimonials. If the tomb was empty, one might expect some independent comment by opponents. For example, the body is missing, stolen perhaps. Instead, we only have Matthew's claim that Jews said the body was stolen, which itself only appears in Matthew, written decades later. Hard to know if that was an actual controversy or Matthew's apologetic invention to counter doubt. The lack of any Roman record of a missing body is not surprising. Romans might not care about a dead provincial preacher's missing corpse. Still, the lack of any Jewish polemic referencing it outside Christian sources is interesting. The first non-Christian reference to Jesus, in a Jewish source, is likely the Talmud, much later, and hostile, saying Jesus was a sorcerer who was dead. If the empty tomb were a widely acknowledged fact, you'd expect some Jewish source to comment on it, even to dismiss it. Instead, later Jewish stories say the opposite, that Jesus' tomb was known and he didn't rise. Some say his body was dragged through streets, which is also likely slander. In any event, we're left with Christian claims and others ignoring or disputing them. So, the absence of neutral evidence does factor in. One weighs the likelihood that if a man truly rose and appeared to hundreds, more fuss would have been made in non-Christian circles. The fact that Christianity remained a relatively minor sect for decades, not experiencing explosive growth until much later, indicates that it wasn't apparent to outsiders that a world-changing miracle had occurred. It spread gradually through preaching and conversion, like other religions. No mass panic in Jerusalem, no verifiable public event beyond believers' claims. All that is circumstantial evidence against the reality of the miracles. Not proof, but weight on the scale. In sum, the absence of evidence is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. Historians don't demand that every event leave physical or textual evidence. They know many don't. However, when an event should have occurred, or when the only evidence comes from interested parties, skepticism is warranted. The apologist might call this a double standard. You accept some history from one source but not this. The difference lies in the nature of the claim. We have one source for some mundane ancient events, and we might provisionally accept those if they fit the context and have no reason to be fabricated. But for extraordinary events, one source, especially a biased one, is not enough. The standards tighten as the claim of extraordinariness increases. That's a rational approach, akin to how a court treats a claim of theft. Maybe one witness can suffice, vs a claim of someone flying by flapping arms. You'd want high-quality video, multiple witnesses, etc. The resurrection is more like the latter category. Archaeology has generally been kind to some biblical history, confirming some kings, places, battles, but not supportive of others. The Exodus, conquest of Canaan as described in Joshua, etc. In the New Testament, archaeology confirms little things. The pool of Bethesda was found, and Pontius Pilate's inscription was found, so he's confirmed as a real figure. But nothing archaeological proves a resurrection or any miracle. Of course, by nature, those wouldn't leave artifacts except an empty tomb. Still, tombs of figures are tricky. We don't have specific tomb identifications for many ancient figures, and an empty tomb by itself wouldn't prove resurrection anyway. so archaeologists' silence on miracles is expected. More noteworthy is its silence or lack of evidence on events like the mass exodus or empire-wide censuses, which suggests that those aspects are not historical. The bottom line is that one cannot excuse away all missing evidence with it's not disproven. By that logic, you'd have to take every ancient myth as equally viable. We use inference to find the best explanation. The best explanation for the pattern of evidence, and lack thereof, surrounding Christian origins is not that the reports are completely historically accurate, but that a mix of real events and legend is at play. The best explanation for the uniform silence of secular history on Jesus' miracles is that those miracles were either non-public, only believers saw them, which raises questions, or they didn't happen as described. The best explanation for contradictions among the Gospels is that they are not inerrant history but layered traditions. By adopting these explanations, we make sense of why evidence looks as it does, which is what a historian aims to do. The apologist's stance often is even if evidence is lacking or contrary, maintain belief, use tiny possibilities to keep faith. That's backwards from historical reasoning, which proportionally adjusts belief to evidence. In conclusion, a responsible approach is to reduce our confidence in a claim when there is a lack of evidence, especially when evidence is expected. Combined with the known fallibility of human memory and tendency for myth-making, it renders many of the apologist's historical assertions untenable by critical standards. Saying you can't disprove it is a poor argument. Many things can't be disproven. We can't disprove unicorns lived in unrecorded corners of history, but that doesn't mean they are likely true. The burden of proof in historical claims lies with the one making the positive assertion. And in the case of Bible events, the proof just isn't meeting a high bar. A rational evaluation yields significant doubt, which the apologist hasn't remotely overcome with independent, reliable, relevant evidence. They mainly repackage the biblical claims themselves as if that's enough, but for historians, it's not. A Mystrikal Rebuttal to the Christian Case for God, Part 13 of 14. The Resurrection. Would you believe it from a competing religion's evidence? The resurrection of Jesus is the linchpin of Christian apologetics. The apologist will often claim the evidence for it is solid. An empty tomb, many eyewitnesses willing to die for their testimony, the explosion of the church in hostile Jerusalem, etc. Let's scrutinize these under the lens of empirical and historical standards. Empty tomb. We have a narrative that Jesus' tomb was found empty by a few of his female followers on Sunday morning. Historically, it's plausible Jesus was buried. Romans often left crucified bodies to decay. Still, the Gospels claim that Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin, obtained permission to bury Jesus in his tomb. That could happen. Pilate might allow it before Passover to avoid offending Jewish sensitivities. John's Gospel suggests that reasoning. However, note that we have no attestations of the empty tomb outside the Gospels. Paul, writing 20 years earlier than Mark, never mentions a tomb, empty or not, in his letters. He states he was buried, and he was raised on the third day, but gives no details. He emphasizes appearances, not the empty grave. The empty tomb story might already have been in circulation, or Paul might have implicitly known it, but his silence is noteworthy. The discovery by women is often said to be unlikely to have been invented. Since women's testimony was supposedly less valued, Christians wouldn't make them primary witnesses unless true. That's a reasonable argument, but not a clincher. It could also be a tradition that started because the women were present at the crucifixion and burial, so naturally they'd be narratively the ones to check the tomb. Even if we grant that the tomb was empty, which apologists often assume as fact, that alone doesn't prove a resurrection. Many natural scenarios can cause an empty tomb, including the removal of the body, by disciples, authorities moving it to a criminal's graveyard, or grave robbers, or misidentification of the tomb, the women going to the wrong tomb in semi-darkness. Apologists argue that the Jews or Romans would have produced the body to quash resurrection preaching if they had it. But would they? The early Christian preaching, as recorded in Acts, does say you killed him, God raised him. If authorities knew where the corpse was, they'd have a strong incentive to show it. However, if the body was quietly moved, the officials might not even know which tomb it ended in. Paperwork wasn't exactly meticulous for executed peasants. They may have just heard that some disciples claim his tomb is empty and shrugged or assumed it was a case of grave robbery. Additionally, initial Christian preaching may not have emphasized the empty tomb. Instead, it focused on visions of Jesus, see Peter's speeches in Acts, which emphasize we are witnesses that God raised him, without explicitly stating and his tomb is empty, although this is implied. So producing a decomposed body weeks later might not convince devotees who have seen Jesus in a vision. They'd just say that's not him or God took him. In short, an empty tomb is ambiguous evidence. By itself, it can't establish a miracle, it just starts a mystery. And in ancient times, missing bodies were not unheard of. Tombs could be robbed or bodies relocated. One archaeological find is a crucified man named Yehohanan, whose heel bone was found in an ossuary, indicating he got a burial, but his initial tomb is unknown. Bodies often later moved to bone boxes. So an empty tomb is not even unprecedented or unexplainable normally. Post-mortem appearances. This is the cornerstone. The disciples and others claim to have seen Jesus alive after death. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 lists some appearances. To Peter, Cephas, to the 12, to over 500 brethren at once, to James, and lastly to Paul himself. Note Paul doesn't distinguish his experience, a vision on the Damascus road, from the others, implying that all these appearances could have been of a visionary nature, not necessarily physical meetings. In Acts, Paul's companions see a light or hear a sound but don't see Jesus, strongly suggesting it was a subjective vision for Paul. The Gospel of Luke even has a story where the risen Jesus appears, but the disciples think they are seeing a spirit until he eats fish to prove corporeality. That suggests the early default was to think of these appearances as maybe ghostly until insisted otherwise. Now, people all around the world throughout history report visions of deceased loved ones. Psychologists call them bereavement hallucinations, and they are more common than realized. Around half of widows have at least one sense experience of their departed spouse, seeing them, hearing their voice, etc., in the months after death. Usually, they don't interpret it as a literal resurrection, but rather as a comforting vision. In a first-century Jewish context, however, visions of someone might be taken as that person being assumed into heaven or given new life. Especially since Jesus had preached about resurrection, the disciples could interpret their experiences in that framework. The over 500 at once claim is often cited as huge. However, critically, we have no details about that event, no names, location, or what was observed. Paul is the only one to mention it. That looks like a bit of a pious rumor that Paul cites to bolster credence. Lots of people saw him. But none of the gospel writers mention such a mass appearance, not even as hearsay. If 500 people had truly seen Jesus simultaneously, say in Galilee, some theorize as the setting, it's surprising no gospel or Acts mentions it explicitly. Maybe because by the time the Gospels were written, that story wasn't widely known or considered credible, or it conflated multiple smaller group sightings. At any rate, we can't cross-examine those 500. Apologists also like to say, 500 witnesses. That's too many to have a mass hallucination. It's true mass hallucinations are not a common concept, though collective experiences can happen under shared suggestion. Think religious revivals where crowds claim to feel a spirit. But we don't know that it was 500 simultaneous hallucinations. We only have Paul's second-hand assertion. The fact that the primary witnesses were all part of Jesus' movement raises the issue of motivated perception. They sincerely wanted Jesus to be the Messiah. His death shattered them. It's psychologically plausible that Peter or Mary Magdalene, in grief, had a vivid vision or dream of Jesus assuring them he's alive in God's presence. That then sparks renewed faith. Humans are also groupish. If one authoritative person like Peter says, "I saw him," others might start to have their own experiences or at least strongly believe Peter. Social reinforcement and the desire to be included could lead to Me Too claims or interpretive frames. Maybe someone felt an inner peace and later describes it as, "and we saw Jesus with us." Without video or multiple outsider accounts, we can't be sure what form these appearances took. However, we do know from numerous documented cases that religious visions are not unusual, especially during times of stress. For example, some followers of the Indian guru Satya Sai Baba report seeing him appear to them after death. Some cargo cults in the Pacific believe their prophet returned after death in visions. These don't lead us to accept those religions as true. We interpret them as socio-psychological phenomena. The Christian resurrection accounts should be handled similarly from a secular perspective. Disciples' martyrdom. It's often said, they wouldn't die for a lie, they were willing to die for their testimony, so they must have truly seen Jesus. A couple of notes. We have little historical record on the fate of most of the 12. Church tradition, much written centuries later, states that they were martyred in various places. Still, outside of James, son of Zebedee, killed by Herod Agrippa, as per Acts, and perhaps Peter and Paul, likely executed in Rome, according to early tradition, it is unclear. But even if many were martyred, dying for their belief only proves sincerity, not that the belief was true. People of many faiths have died for their sincerely held beliefs. The early disciples believed Jesus rose, but as argued, they could have been sincerely mistaken due to visions. They wouldn't consider it a lie, they were convinced. Martyrdom of believers doesn't count as evidence of a miracle, it's evidence of their conviction. Rapid spread in Jewish context. Apologists sometimes say, Jews had no concept of a single person rising ahead of general resurrection, so something extraordinary must have happened to make them believe this. The disciples' proclamation was indeed unusual. They reproposed Jewish hopes of resurrection for the Messiah himself. But religious innovation happens. If they were convinced by experiences that their master was exalted, they could reinterpret theology. They did, coming to see the Messiah as one who suffers and rises, which was not the prevailing view. The cognitive dissonance of Jesus' death might have made them latch onto any sign that he was still around, to save face on having followed him. Also, not all Jews needed convincing. Many remained unconvinced, which is why Christianity was a minority sect. It wasn't so compelling that everyone said, "Oh, you're right, he rose." Far from it. Christianity faced much resistance among Jews and turned increasingly to Gentiles. This suggests that the evidence wasn't unequivocal. It was persuasive only to those predisposed or directly impacted. Historical analogies. It's instructive to compare the evidence of the resurrection with that of events like Muhammad's night journey or Joseph Smith's golden plates. In both those cases, followers testified to miraculous or supernatural events. Smith had 11 witnesses who signed statements that they saw the plates or an angel. Yet those outside the faiths find reasons to doubt. The witnesses were believers and possibly colluded, etc. We hold the resurrection to a less critical standard at our peril. If someone today claimed a dead preacher rose and appeared to 500, but all the evidence was a few letters and writings from his devotees, would we believe it? We'd likely suspect it's either a hoax or a self-delusion. The only reason many give the resurrection story more weight is because it's ancient and venerable. But logically, that should make us more cautious. Stories grow over time. Falsifiability. The resurrection claim isn't falsifiable by experiment. We can't rerun those events. But historically, one could conceive of evidence that would strengthen or weaken the case. Strengthen, finding a tomb with a body and evidence that it's Jesus, which would strongly weaken belief if we could identify remains, improbable now. Or finding early source documents that said we moved Jesus's body, etc. We have none of that, but the absence of contrary evidence doesn't prove it occurred. It just means the mystery remains. It was a singular claimed event, and in science, one-off, unrepeated events, especially those violating customary law, are inherently difficult to establish. If tomorrow many saints' tombs were to open and they walked out, documented on live TV, that might retroactively lend credence to first-century resurrection claims, like okay, maybe sometimes nature breaks that way. However, so far, we view death as a one-way street in all empirical observations. The heavy prior probability against resurrection, since billions of people have died, and none have been verified to have risen physically, means that any evidence for one needs to be extremely strong to overcome it. The evidence for the resurrection, as discussed, doesn't reach that threshold. From a scientific viewpoint, the resurrection is not a hypothesis that can be tested or confirmed with physical evidence. It's a miracle claim that relies on testimonial evidence. Such evidence would never pass muster in a scientific publication or a courtroom as proof of something so extraordinary. This is why even many believing historians say that while they believe the resurrection, they acknowledge that it's based on faith, not the standard rules of historical proof. A non-believer evaluating the data can reasonably conclude that the simplest explanation, requiring the fewest new assumptions, is that Jesus stayed dead and the disciples had visionary experiences. That explanation aligns with established psychological and historical patterns, such as visionary movements and martyrdoms, and doesn't require positing a suspension of biological principles. The apologist will object. But then how do you explain the empty tomb and appearances? That theory doesn't neatly explain everything. Perhaps not every detail, no theory explains everything in the messy history. But natural theories collectively explain the core pieces without invoking the supernatural. The tomb could be empty due to removal, appearances explained by visions, and rapid belief spread by social and religious forces. These may individually sound less exciting than God did a miracle, but they are plausible and in line with everyday human experiences. We have evidence that people steal bodies, have visions, and start new religions. We have no comparable evidence of literal resurrections. So the scale tips to the mundane. It's also worth noting that early Christianity had to deal with skeptical rebuttals even then. Matthew 28 verse 13 acknowledges a counterclaim, that the disciples stole the body. This indicates that the empty tomb alone convinced no skeptics. Alternative narratives sprang up immediately. The Christian response was no, the guard was there, the disciples couldn't have. But historians can question whether Matthew's guard story, only in Matthew, was a later apologetic addition precisely to counter that accusation. The mere presence of that accusation in Christian texts shows not everyone bought their story, even in the 1st century. If the evidence was so ironclad, why didn't the majority of Jews or others convert? Because it wasn't ironclad, it was convincing primarily to those who trusted the witnesses. In sum, examining the resurrection claim by critical standards, the evidence, one primary set of documents written by believers, is not robust. The claim is extraordinary, violating everything we know biologically, and alternative explanations, while perhaps not provable, are far less extraordinary and thus favored by methodological naturalism. A scientist or historian can reasonably say, I cannot prove with certainty what happened 2,000 years ago, but based on analogous events and lack of strong evidence, the resurrection is improbable to be a literal fact. It fits a pattern of religious mythologizing. This is not a popular conclusion in Christian circles, but it is the one that aligns with a consistent empirical approach. If a Mormon says, but 11 people saw the angel with the plates, the Christian skeptic will find natural explanations, they lied, or it was a vision, etc. The same type of skepticism applied to Christianity's foundational miracle yields natural explanations. Unless we're willing to accept all miracle claims from all religions, we need to be even-handed. Christianity doesn't get a pass because it's more familiar. We need to see if it meets the bar of evidence. It doesn't. It only meets the bar of faith, which is precisely believing without seeing or without requiring rigorous proof. That's fine in a religious context, but the question at hand is whether the apologists' claims stand up to scientific and historical scrutiny. They don't. They rely on tradition, the authority of scripture, and emotional appeal. When confronted with strict evidentiary demands, they fall short, much as any ancient miracle story would. A Mystrikal Rebuttal to the Christian Case for God, Part 14 of 14. Conclusion. The theist's multipoint defense crumbles under careful analysis. Each claim, from cosmological necessity to moral ontology to biblical reliability, is founded on unwarranted assumptions, logical leaps, or misuses of evidence. We find that invoking God as a necessary being explains nothing. It's a grandiose label lacking empirical support, an attempt to exempt one entity from rules without justification. The arguments repeatedly insert God into gaps in knowledge and claim it as an explanation, while dismissing well-grounded scientific possibilities. This is classic God of the gaps reasoning, however much they protest otherwise. The supposed immaterial requisites, logic, morals, consciousness, turn out not to point to the supernatural at all, once we consider how they can emerge from natural structures and agreements. The theist posits a mysterious source where none is needed, violating the principle of parsimony. The portrayal of atheism as another faith is a false equivalence. Atheism stands on demanding evidence and staying tentative, whereas the theist position demands we accept dogmas that cannot be tested or falsified. There's nothing blind about insisting on reliable, objective evidence. Indeed, that is the opposite of blind faith. Historically, the Gospels and resurrection evidence, when held to accepted historical standards, do not compel a miraculous conclusion. They resemble the types of sources and stories that every other religion or legend has offered, which we routinely question. The apologist's method often reduces to special pleading, making special exceptions for their God and texts that they'd never grant to a rival religion or to a scientific hypothesis that is flimsy. It's an intellectual double standard. The mark of a robust explanation is that it can be challenged, tested, and still account for the data. The theistic explanations offered fail this test. They are insulated from testing, God is outside time, beyond investigation, and often ignore conflicting data, such as gospel inconsistencies or the evolutionary origins of human traits. In contrast, a scientific or skeptical approach might not have complete answers to every big question yet, but it plays by the rules of evidence and coherence, and it's willing to say we don't know, let's keep looking rather than stop looking. We have an answer. Ultimately, the apologetic arguments are a tapestry of assumptions mistaken for conclusions. They assume a necessary being, assume gaps mean God, assume only God can explain X, assume the Bible is reliable, and then use those assumptions to prove that belief in God is rational and necessary. But once we dismantle each assumption, showing, for example, that the universe's existence might just be a brute fact, or that moral behavior can come from evolution, or that ancient texts are not trustworthy simply because they are old, the entire tapestry unravels. What's left is an appeal to mystery and faith, which is fine for personal belief but utterly inadequate as proof or explanation. By holding each claim to the standards of logic and evidence, asking if it's falsifiable, if it's supported by data, if it avoids contradiction and special pleading, we've seen each fail. The apologist's case, which at first glance seems comprehensive, reveals itself as a series of unsupported leaps over the very gaps they claim to fill. A contingent universe is not evidence of God. Ignorance of a mechanism is not license to insert magic. The existence of immaterial concepts doesn't imply a supernatural realm. Calling atheism faith doesn't make it so, and citing ancient testimonies doesn't override fundamental improbabilities. The claims fail scientifically because they are either not testable or already contradicted by known evidence, and they fail historically because they don't meet the criteria of reliable sourcing and corroboration. In a court of empirical scrutiny, the theist's argument is found wanting. It lacks sufficient evidence, exhibits internal inconsistencies, and appeals to authority rather than demonstration. We can and should uphold a higher standard for what we accept as true about reality. It's telling that when we strip away the layers of philosophical jargon and baseless certainty, we find the emperor has no clothes. The grand argument reduces to we assert this must be so, because otherwise we'd feel lost. That may be emotionally understandable, but it's not a rational justification. True understanding comes from confronting the unknown honestly, not adorning it with imaginary kings. As our analysis has shown, every natural phenomenon the apologist attributes to God can be explained, or is better left unexplained pending objective evidence, without invoking the supernatural. And every historical claim they make wilts when faced with impartial historical method. The more one relies on rigorous evidence, the less one finds the God hypothesis necessary or even useful. In conclusion, the apologist's confidence is unfounded. Their arguments are a house of cards built on intuition and tradition rather than solid ground. Dismantling each card leaves us not in intellectual chaos, but with a clearer view of reality as it is, awe-inspiring, sometimes puzzling, but ultimately best approached with open-minded inquiry and critical thinking rather than dogma. It is in that relentless pursuit of reliable knowledge, unfettered by ancient presuppositions, that we truly honor the human intellect. Any worldview that demands we suspend that pursuit or accept special exceptions is the one truly guilty of intellectual laziness. The apologist has tried to put reason in the service of faith. We have done the opposite, putting their faith claims under the light of reason and found them consistently insufficient.